Welcome, 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 and three more welcomes. Welcome, welcome, welcome to everybody joining us for part of our continuing series where we talk to people on the left, people on the right, professors, academics, activists, reporters, columnists, anybody who can think clearly and intelligently. And we want to package their information and provide it to you unedited and unaltered so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it won't. Who knows? I hope we'll have a renaissance. We'll see. With us today, it is our privilege to have David S. Brown. He's the Dean and Professor of Politics at Drexel University. He joined Drexel University on September 1st, 2022 as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor in the Department of Politics. After receiving his PhD in political science from UCLA, great school, he was named the inaugural Kenneth Boulding Postdoctorate Fellow at the Institute for Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dean Brown's first tenure track position was at Rice University. After 5 years at Rice, he returned to CU Boulder for the next 20 years. CU Boulder, he served as the chair of the Department of Political Science for 6 years and division dean of the social sciences for 2 years. So that's 2 deanships. Dean Brown's body of work centers on political institutions and their impact on economic development. His scholarship explores democracy and its effects on economic growth and well-being. He recently completed the textbook Introduction to Statistics in the Art and Practice of Data Analysis. Other publications include articles on democracy and its significance on homicide rates, the labor supply, and the labor share of income. Previously, he was a member of the National Science Foundation-funded team investigating the influence of the World Bank program on local politics in the Brazilian Amazon. This research effort led to many articles. His related expertise uses spatial statistical analyses to study patterns of worldwide democratization and deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. I love that. The central focus of his early research involved investigating the influence democracy has on government spending. In particular, the emphasis of this work examined democracy's impact on the resources allocated to health, education, and welfare. His teaching includes comparative politics, the political economy of development, and statistics. In addition, he's a frequent guest lecturer on active learning pedagogies concentrated explicitly on flipping the classroom. He's also served as the co-chair of the Quality Teaching Initiative at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's a political scientist because he's very much interested in economic development and the impact that democracies have on how countries function. He was interested in why some countries succeed and others don't in a variety of ways, not only economic growth, but in education, human capital, that sort of thing. He started out working with his brother on issues that had to do with deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. He had the chance to work on an NSF grant with his brother and another colleague, looking at the impacts of politics on deforestation in the Amazon. Started administrative training, was able to go to Brazil as much, and kept looking at democracy and authoritarianism. That's a good point, as their impacts on different things change. Let's see here. Some of the works that he's done is diffusion of democracy, the effects of capital mobility, trade openness, democracy on social spending in Latin America, democracy and social spending in Latin America, democracy and human capital formation, education spending in Latin America, the transforming power of democracy, regime type and the distribution of electricity, reading, writing, and regime type, democracy impact, democracy, colonization, human capital in sub-Saharan Africa. That's very relevant now. Political polarization is constrained on corruption, a cross-national comparison. That's the one that we found them. There's the book, and this is the study. But before we get to that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Do I need to correct anything with your bio, sir?
Not at all. I appreciate the introduction.
Okay. Well, let's, I do want to take a second to mention your book, Statistics and Data Visualization Using R, the Art and Practice of Data Analysis. David Brown teaches students statistics through charts, graphs, and displays of data that help students develop intuition around statistics, as well as data visualization skills. By focusing on the visual nature of statistics instead of mathematical proofs and derivations, students can see the relationship between variables that are the foundation of quantitative analysis. Using the latest tools in R and RR Studio for calculations and data visualization, students learn valuable skills they can take with them into a variety of future careers in the public sector, the private sector, or academia. But this is the study. Let's see, I'm trying to get there. Political polarization as a constraint on government, evidence of corruption from 2006. What what was this study about? Before I read the abstract, what was the study about, Professor? And why did you do it in 2006? What's going on in 2006 where political polarization and corruption are relevant? And what did you find in this study, Professor?
Yeah, I think the interest really grew out of, as we said in the introduction, a concern for economic development. So during that time, there was a debate among economists primarily about corruption and its impact on economic development, and trying to figure out what the different drivers of corruption were. And so always looking to play in economics and to add to whatever they're talking about, especially given that they're often looking at political institutions. We came at it from a little bit different of an angle, in the sense that a lot of the things that we saw being studied had everything to do with the usual cut and dried institutions that you see in a number of different statistical studies: democracy, different kinds of voting, electoral rules, whether or not a government is divided or not. And we came across a measure that was it's political polarization. It measures how far the top four parties are from each other in a legislature, and we wondered whether or not that was going to have an impact as relevant as the institution itself on corruption. And so one of the things that we found, in fact, the thing that really sort of excited us about it, was that there was a strong relationship between how polarized a legislature was and corruption in sort of a way that you wouldn't think. And what we found was that the more polarized the society was, as measured through the legislature, there was actually better control of corruption. And so that was something that we thought was fairly interesting.
The more polarized the legislature, the more control of corruption there is.
Right. And the reason, yeah, go ahead.
No, please. Why is that?
Yeah. So going into it, there are a number of different theories as to why this might happen. And we borrowed heavily from work done by George Sabellis on veto players. And his idea was that the more checkpoints, let's say, you have in the government, the more different either constitutional bodies or individuals have to sign off on something, the more democratic it is, and you get better policy that way. But another thing that he added to that was, it's not only the number of people that have to sign off on it, the number of people that have checks and balances, it's how far apart those people are in terms of ideology. Mm-hmm. And so we found that, again, the further people were ideologically from each other, the more that people felt corruption was being under control. And a lot of it actually stemmed from work that one of my co-authors, Michael Touchton, and at the time a graduate student, he was looking at a number of different Latin American countries, and what he was seeing is that he saw clear evidence that in countries where either the president had firm control over everything and that there wasn't really much ideological distance between parties, he found that corruption was fairly endemic. And so that sort of prompted us to go look at this, and we found that the opposite relationship is the case. And the reason that is that the further you are away from your political opponent, in order to enact legislation with them, it's just that much more expensive. And it's also the case that in the future, you're probably not going to end up being in any kind of agreement or coalition with that person. And as a result, you can sort of take them to task. You can sort of push the go nuclear in a sense, and investigate them in a way that you wouldn't otherwise do. And so the idea there is that the more expensive it is to form a coalition, the more likely it is that you're going to say, look, in the future, that coalition is not going to happen. And so going after your opponents, taking a magnifying glass and looking at everything they're doing, is one political strategy that folks use in a polarized society.
So with increased political polarization, we could expect decreased corruption. Is that fair?
That's the implication.
Does that mean a more effective government? Multiple parties constantly investigating each other, a system, because I'm Mexican and my grandma told us, I remember asking her, my abuelita, when I was young, I'm like, why are there so many Latin people here? And she goes, because America invaded every country in Latin America and destabilized them, and now they're all dysfunctional governments. And then I got my first subscription to Foreign Affairs magazine at 18, and I learned about the concept of a failed Latin American democracy, and there's a lot of truth to it. Oh, did I lose an election to you? Oh, I win an election? Well, now I'll investigate you and try to have you locked up. Did you think that you won an election? I'll just have my team deny that for the next 4 years because I feel like it. And those were signs of a failed system across the board, a country that could not get its act together at all. And now those things are happening here in America. Yeah. A good sign that everything's okay because, hey, corruption's going to go down, or perhaps a bad sign, in your opinion, Professor?
It's the one thing that we found interesting was that a lot of folks would look at polarization and they would say, because of the differences that you see, it's bad in all cases. And what we found was that, in fact, actually, there is, I don't think it necessarily saves the day, but right. What one needs to think about is that polarization, it may have a good impact on some aspects of government, but in others, it certainly doesn't. And so clearly, in terms of getting legislation going, that sort of thing, not so good. Yes, on the flip side, so for example, if you have a situation where, and we were perfectly cognizant of the case in which, if I'm in power, it's time to go after my opponents who challenged me. If we were seeing that, now that certainly happens, but if that was the overriding mechanism that was working, we would have found the opposite in our results. We would have found that, in fact, polarization led to more corruption, because that would be the main story. But what we're finding is that's not the main story. The main story is more likely, at least in the corruption sense, is that it has a check, because there's no doubt cases where people are going after each other on pretty tenuous grounds, let's say, but that's not, if that were the case, then you would see that more polarization, more corruption, but that's not what we see in the data. So the opposite story seems to be holding strong. Now, what's interesting is that, there's all sorts of other reasons why polarization causes all sorts of problems for government. And it could be the case, and this is one of the things that we pointed to, is that different kinds of governments, that polarization may actually be much more ruinous than it would be in others. But so the main point is that polarization, I guess in some ways you could say we found a silver lining in it, in that there is one thing that it seems to have a meritorious effect on.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because you would think, oh, polarization, bad, nasty, so whenever it's here, everything else must be bad, nasty. Well, actually, no. There are some positive benefits to it. And I recall speaking with some other professors, and they said, look, you can't look at polarization as just bad on its own. That's like saying bacteria is just bad. A lot of bacteria is bad, but our stomachs, our bodies need a certain amount of bacteria for us to have natural processes and live. So we can't just go, all bacteria bad, kill all bacteria. We would kill ourselves. At the same time, obviously, you don't want to be swimming in bacteria. So there seems to be they said, there has to be a level of polarization, because you have to have a couple different parties with different ideas in order for things to get done. And so we shouldn't have this idea that everybody needs to hold hands and sing Kumbaya as an effective government, because it's not. But you can also ratchet it up too far, where now we're completely dysfunctional and can't get anything passed. So absolutely, I see that. There's some benefits to polarization at a workable level. And certainly your topic about increased polarization equals less corruption. I mean, we had the Democrats investigate Donald Trump for every possible thing that he could have done. And I'm not a fan of his, and I think he's corrupt too. So there's that. But now that we have the Republicans in charge, they're mad and they're investigating Joseph Biden for everything he's done. And it sort of looks like I'm just going to say there may be something there. I'll leave it there. There may be something there. So, yeah, absolutely. We're highly polarized and everybody's going after everybody with investigations. In theory, that should mean no corrupt politicians, I guess.
Well, it's interesting. I think that certainly, let's put it this way: if you are a politician and you have your children are involved in anything that's sort of related, my sense is that you'd be extra careful right now as a result. Let's just put it that way, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in fact, some of the, as I was sort of reflecting on this, is that as if you look at some of the investigations into the FBI, for example, where some emails were uncovered about some, to say the least, some unprofessional activity. That's probably not going to happen. I think people are going to be extra careful or be very cognizant of the fact of, okay, no, we're not even going to go there. We're not going to touch it. Now, that can go too far where people are really worried about enforcing the law when it needs to be enforced. But nonetheless, I think to some degrees it has said, okay, you've got to be really careful, right? But that's not necessarily, in all cases, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I think that's a great thing. I remember the Mueller investigation of Donald Trump. And again, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. But I am a fan of the truth. And in the Mueller investigation, ex-FBI agent, a retired, and he was going to look no stone unturned, and he's the best guy, and he's basically Elliot Ness of our times, back from the dead, able to take down whoever. And that's great. But after they built up this reputation around him and the trial, and all the great work he'd done and all the super staff and, all this righteousness behind him. Then it comes out that two people, I think it was Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, had been sharing text messages with each other, basically saying, we're going to get him, meaning Trump. Yep. That colored the entire investigation. Yep. And then people and I have a lot of conservative friends, and they're going, okay, so did Mueller not know that was happening, which means he didn't double check his people, which means he's incompetent? Or did he know that was happening, which means he too is corrupt? And after that came out, you're right. The FBI stepped up their game to make sure their T's were crossed and their I's were dotted, which I thought you were supposed to do anyways. I remember the concept of Lady Justice was blind with a scale, which means she's not supposed to be biased or have any preconceived conditions. She's only supposed to look at the merits of the data there. If the FBI is returning more towards that, or at least aware of the visualization of that, certainly that's a good thing. We want law enforcement to seem not biased. And also, you can get a case thrown out for that kind of stuff. That's not good.
Yeah. So the idea is that, with polarization and the idea that, it is the case. There are plenty of situations where politicians will come in and use the bureaucracy toward their end. But you also see, like you said, the FBI is now dotting their I's and crossing their T's. And it's also the case where it may be that, here's the hope, right, is that the bureaucracy itself will become it will take extraordinary pains to be as neutral as possible to retain its credibility. Because especially in a time like ours, that's one of the things that's come out to be one of the most important things to sort of help keep democracy alive, to be quite honest. So
Yeah.
that's, again, I'm probably being overly optimistic from the results that we have here, but that is an implication, and we'll just have to see. I mean, it'd be interesting to take that result and derive a number of different implications that we might be able to test in what's going on today.
So when I was looking at the Pew Research, they do surveys, very reputable survey organization. They were showing the lowest amount of faith of the American people in basically every single form of the federal government, CIA, FBI, Congress, legislature, president, Supreme Court, except for the military. Military is the one thing where Americans are like, yeah, right on. Everything else, though, they basically have soured to the lowest point in 40 years, almost half a decade. So if the FBI is saying we need to step it up so that we have even better credibility, I think that's a great idea. And now's the time to do that, because you guys are kind of at your lowest rate since the 1960s. I'm not saying you deserve that. I'm just saying Pew surveys saying that. And when you have a society that doesn't trust law enforcement, doesn't trust their elected officials, doesn't trust government, I don't really see that going anyplace good.
No, yeah. And again, it sort of gets to the point where, yes, there probably are, the cases where politicians are using the bureaucracy towards their own ends to get retribution, or to make sure that their person they just defeated doesn't have a chance in the next time up. But it's, I think that the institutions now know that that kind of thing is going to happen, and so therefore are going to be extra careful. And so the kinds of things that you saw in the Mueller investigation hopefully will not be happening. And I would say, the U.S. military, hopefully, maintains that credibility by maintaining its neutrality and its ability to do that. And so that's an instance where, even more so, even in a more polarized situation, that's extremely important.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. I just remember in college, they taught us about Thomas More, who wrote the book Utopia, as he was an aide to the King of England, the king, I think, who later had him killed. But the book Utopia was the basis of all law. And it was called Utopia, meaning, and the whole idea was everybody had to follow the same law. That was the big idea. Not just laws for peasants. The kings and nobles had to follow the same. This is the breakthrough 500 years ago. But one of the key points he said was that you have to have laws that everybody believe are just. So if you have a bunch of laws like murder's wrong, victimization is wrong, robbery is wrong, and then you have one on eating strawberries on a Tuesday afternoon is wrong, that's not going to hold. The people are going to go, well, why is it criminal to eat strawberries on a Tuesday afternoon? That makes no sense. So he said the key to this whole system was having laws that made sense because they applied to everybody. And so when we have, basically people have to believe the legal system's fair, is what he's talking about. And when you have laws and officials enact those laws or police the laws and they appear to be not fair, then you have a breakdown of public trust of the law and your whole society collapses. That's what he was saying 500 years ago. It looks similar. I got to tell you, when we see the FBI raid of Trump's Mar-a-Lago house, which, hey, he shouldn't have kept those documents, right? That's bad. That's wrong. But we had such low trust in the government. You have Republican politicians coming out the next day saying there's going to be riots in the streets. There's death threats against the FBI. Merrick Garland comes on TV, the attorney general. He clearly is terrified, trying to cover himself. Mm-hmm. And I kept thinking, we would never be in this situation if the public had more faith in law enforcement being impartial. The only reason we're here now is, right or wrong, not agreeing, right or wrong, a good chunk of the country thinks law enforcement basically does whatever the other political party wants. I'm not agreeing with that statement. I'm just saying not good for societal stability, right? When we have one group feel, well, the government's not really fair. They're kind of an arm of the other side to come and pick on me. That also is instability. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a couple of things that come to mind as you were talking, Marcus. One was that, first of all, one of the things that we found in that article is that, institutions and the law themselves are certainly important, but let's not discount who actually are in those institutions. And so
Mm,
that's one of the things that's really that being an institutionalist myself, that was a result that I really hadn't counted on, or I'd seen before in the stuff that I'd done. The other part of it is what I'm always, you think about how the DOJ, the FBI, and other organizations now are conducting business. So I can imagine, let's put it this way, when they went in and this is just a guess on my part, but my sense is that if when the FBI went to Mar-a-Lago, they were really, really careful. They made sure that they were following the law, that everything was done, that it couldn't be questioned, right? And so you can see that in the way some of the indictments, some of these cases are being put together, the extra care that's involved. And so, you could look at that and say, well, people are sort of being extremely careful because of the political nature of it. And because half of the country is going, we don't trust you. In some respects, that may be causing an extra air of caution and professionalism in those particular organizations. But again, that's implied from what we're seeing. Whether or not that's actually happening is another question.
it's implied. It's implied. Certainly, it was not good for optics that it came out after the Mar-a-Lago raid that Biden also had secret documents in
Yeah.
multiple locations. Why didn't we hear about that before the raid? We conveniently heard about that after the raid, and then we were told by the same Justice Department, it's all good. Nothing's bad going to have against them, even though he has more documents in more locations, and he was vice president when he did it, which means he has no debatable authority to declassify those documents. And we heard that afterwards. A lot of people were going, isn't that weird? That's interesting. Again, bringing some colorization, questioning to the other thing I also recently found out, they couldn't get a grand jury in Florida to okay the search warrant. So they went to a grand jury in Washington, D.C. to approve a search warrant in Florida, which is exceptionally irregular, not illegal, but irregular. That too will cause the public to question the legality of the whole thing. Not a good look. We don't want the public questioning why the Justice Department did something or didn't do something. And I got to say, those facts coming out weeks later after the event does not help build public confidence from what I've seen.
Well, to some degree, yes, and some, there is, there is a healthy questioning of it, right? So to some degree, maybe, if it does, I can imagine that the conversations right now in the DOJ are such that they're very now cognizant of, okay, what's, half the nation going to think?
Right.
And now that can be paralyzing, and it can cause them to not do things. But my guess is it would also, I bet the phrase "by the book" has been used a lot more in the last few years. But again, I'm trying to, I think, make again, I'm looking at the silver lining here.
Sure.
Because it can go too far when you question the actual institution itself just based on what you're being told by media, but not what's going on procedurally. That's another story, and there's no doubt that that's extremely dangerous. But it doesn't help. It doesn't hurt to have some skepticism. And perhaps one could say maybe the long years of strong public support for some of these institutions cause them to be a little bit lax. And so now, they're getting their act together. It's not that it was anything untoward or nefarious, but clearly a lot of the things that probably would have just sort of said, "Oh, that's close enough. We can do it that way."
Right.
It's not going to pass muster now.
Right. Because I watched a lot of documentaries on the FBI in the 80s when they were taking
Yeah.
the New York mob. They were very much, everything has to be totally perfect. There cannot be one mistake anywhere in any document at any point. And perception was a huge part of that. Rudolph Giuliani, I understand he's not
No.
such a great man now, but at the time he made sure to say, this is not about picking on Italian people. This is about, I'm an Italian person. That's what Giuliani said. It's about going after the mafia. So that whole thing was dot your T's, cross your T's, dot your I's, and let's worry about public perception. And it was all packaged to one all the way through. And that's why we decimated the American mafia, and they had no chance of coming back, and there was no retrials. And so I know we had that discipline at one point. I hope it returns. I'll leave it there. Let me ask you another question. Political polarization from the level you saw in 2006, is it worse now in 2023?
Oh, certainly. I think that, to some degree, events in the United States around 2006, 2007 were not really sort of what were driving us to this result. I think, at least for me, and I think the co-authors as well, primarily interested in what did this all mean for economic development, standard of living, that sort of thing. And it could very well. I mean, one of the things that we did find that speaks a little bit to this idea of how polarization it has gotten worse in all sorts of different measures. It has gotten much worse. And what we found in our article was that going from very low levels of polarization to median levels of polarization really didn't have much of an effect. It was that medium to high where things really changed. I think, things could get a lot worse, I suppose, but I think between 2007 and now, things have gotten from that medium case up to the higher levels of polarization. And we found that that's really where these things start to have an impact on corruption. So again, if our data are correct, one thing that would be really interesting to see is, okay, do we see in a number of different measures in the justice system, what's going on in terms of different crimes committed? Does it seem as though there's less corruption just in the last few years than there was, let's say, between 2012 and 2020? So that's something that would be really interesting to take a look at. I don't know what the answer would be, but if our results held sway there, it's really this last, I'd say probably 10 years. Things were getting pretty bad, certainly by 2012. The Obama presidency really heightened a lot of that polarization, I think, whether not necessarily through any actions other than him being president. And so that would be something that would be interesting to look at.
What do you, for our listeners, what do you mean polarization was getting bad in 2012? Pretend I was in a cave. What was going on in 2012? Why was it bad? Because I'm in California, and what we're told is everything was perfect. Everybody loved each other. And then Donald Trump came and he single-handedly made all the problems that we see today never existed before him. So when I see people go, did you hear about the Tea Party and Obama? I'm like,
well, yeah, that's exactly
what was going on?
Yeah, no, I think, well, you had, a number of different things. One is one shouldn't underestimate the impact of the financial crisis on the entire mood of everything, really. Okay. And so you couple that with, like you said, the Tea Party, a president that just by being president concerned a part of the population, and just the increase of social media, increase of popularization of you know, talk radio and its impact on politics. All of those things, I mean, were starting to happen in those years. And for me, I would say, I'm not an expert on polarization itself in the United States, but it seems to me that it was happening long before 2016. And in fact, 2016 is, in many respects, the instantiation or the symptom of the underlying trends that have been happening in the country since before that time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's partly why I started the series. Was everybody in California was like Trump, and I'm like, okay, so Newt Gingrich never went after Clinton. George W. Bush wasn't slightly polarizing around the Iraq War. The Tea Party with Obama never happened. These things just didn't exist. It's just, everything was perfect. And then we go in the California mind. I'm cartooning a little bit, but it roughly goes Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and then goes to Donald Trump. Like it was kind of working. And then now Trump's here and he broke everything apart. And it was kind of this perfect state of nature before him. And I'm like, I never really bought that. I thought it was the natural evolution of things that had been gradually getting worse over time. Certainly when you look at the fact that Trump did not bring racism to the political party all on his own. You can look at his early work with the Tea Party. He was learning from them when they were big what messages were working. He was taking a lot of their messaging and repeating it. And there's this period where he's not leading, he's following. He's trying to get into that group. He's trying to figure out what words they want and do that. And that's where the Bertha came from. Bertha thing was incredibly racist and polarizing. And that was before Trump was even announcing that he was running. So I'm like, and that was because the Tea Party loved hearing about Obama being a fake American. I mean, they loved it. And I'm like, that's the seeding ground for Trump right there. They didn't come out of nowhere.
No, just in terms of polarization in politics, I think that one can point back to Newt Gingrich, and it was just a new style of combat actually in the legislature that I think took a lot of people by surprise, and it sort of became the norm. It's interesting. During the 90s and 2000s, I had been studying Brazil, and Brazil was a very different country than the United States in terms of politics. But as time wore on, and you had the rise of Bolsonaro, it became really clear that in some respects, the way in which politics became fought in Brazil started mirroring, forget about the ideology, forget about the substance of it. It's just the way that it was carried out started mimicking what we were seeing in the United States. And so it's, for me, it's really, ideologies aside, it's sort of the process, the media, how it works, how it makes money, and how it sort of, it can generate that. And that was, again, we're talking, the seeds of that starting in the mid 1980s, really. And so I think maybe your audience is just too young to remember.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. And it's unfortunate, but I don't know if youth is it, because I'll talk to people who are in their 50s or 60s and they'll go, Donald Trump's the worst we've ever had. He's so stupid and ignorant. And I go, what about when George W. Bush went on TV and said to the world, I don't read, and then smiled like he really did something? That makes us look intelligent. And people are like, what are you talking about? What? And I'm like, yeah, that happened. The guy went on television and said, I don't read. And he was proud about saying that. How's that good? How's that make us look not stupid? And then he also said, I want to launch a crusade on the Middle East. That seems like a flub. I mean, I've heard people going, oh, nobody's ever made flubs like Trump. And I go, you told 1/5 of the planetary population you want to launch a crusade on them, and then you go, whoops, I didn't mean that word. That's not a flub. And people had no memory of that at all. I mean,
Interesting.
it
Yeah.
goes back to Obama, and then it just disappears. Like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. And I go, Trump's killed all these people. And I go, he hasn't killed more people than George W. Bush. Oh, all the coronavirus deaths. And I go, yeah, we killed 1 million civilians, according to the UN, in Iraq, who were not terrorists because of the invasion there, who didn't need to die. We did? Really? When that happened? No memory. No memory at all. It goes Trump, Obama, and then it goes into the epiphany, just cloud space. They have no idea about Bush, etc. I'm like, 1 million brown-skinned people who didn't need to die for lies is kind of a lot of people to get killed, right? We did that? Really? And then I'll also bring up the video where George Bush joked about it in front of an audience of 100 Americans who laughed. He goes, he was trying to criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which shouldn't have happened. And he goes, Russia, a big country, cannot invade Iraq based upon I'm sorry, I meant Ukraine. Well, Iraq too. And then 100 people laugh. And I go, there's 1 million civilians, not terrorists, dead. And that's funny.
Yeah.
And no criticism. And I go, wow, okay, well, I guess that's the country I live in. But people have no memory of that. So it just goes Obama, who was pretty competent, and then you compare Trump to Obama. Yeah, it looks bad, but you compare Trump to Bush W. I'm like, come on, guys. He also didn't win the election and got to be president. No memory. Total blank out, at least here in California. So I'll leave it there. You're absolutely right. There does seem to be a pushback on democracy. We've seen it in the Philippines. We've seen it in Hungary. We've seen it here in America with Trump. We've seen it with Bolsonaro in Brazil. I've seen other people bring that up, and they go, well, Trump's an aberration. And they go, well, then how come even Brexit? They're saying Brexit was part of this push because Brexit was about, we don't want those nasty Muslims here in our country. How do we keep them out? That was the driving force. That, and you'll get an extra $1 million from your pension or something the moment we leave. So we're seeing these nativist sentiments. This is us. You're not us. I'm going to cut through the niceties and just be blunt with you. I mean, the Duterte in the Philippines was cursing at Obama and yelling and screaming and calling him names I won't repeat here. Kind of Trumpish behavior.
Yeah.
And then Bolsonaro, etc. So do you have an idea? You don't have to, but do you have an idea why it seems like parts of the entire democratic world around the planet are starting to lose their mind at roughly the same time?
I've got a hypothesis, not so much as a theory. One hypothesis.
Theory.
I really do think I am
theory. It's a theory.
I'm struck by the effect that, and I know that this is sort of a popular culprit, but I do think that social media and how we interact with it has had a big impact on it, and it would help explain. I mean, I there's more and more work done on it. I'm not as familiar as I should be with it, but the impact that it has on how politicians use it and how it does. You're gonna, in many respects, all you have to do is you look at Trump's campaign in 2016 and Bolsonaro, who were unbelievably talented at using those platforms to make inroads. Even though, certainly in Trump's case, he didn't have to use any of his own money, and it wasn't just social media. The mainstream media also,
right?
They were featuring his, well, what's he going to say next? Let's go there now. And so, I think you see the same thing by all accounts. That's what Bolsonaro was able to do in Brazil. And so in many respects, you have two countries that are very different from each other, but also whose populations rely a lot on getting their news from those sources. And so I think that, you know, this is where comparing countries, I think, can give us some insight. There was really no reason to expect Brazilian and US politics to start looking like each other back in the 1990s, 2000s. But all of a sudden they started to look like each other. And to me, it was more in form rather than substance. But that form, capitalized on those sorts of things that help the right. So that would be, if I had the theory as to why this is happening and democracy has been challenged throughout the world, it's because of the way social media interacts with politics and how politicians use them now. Some very in a very sophisticated way. And so really what I've come down to in my old age here, there's no guarantee. This kind of gets back to your point earlier about not remembering history. I don't think there's any guarantee for democracy other than you have a population that is informed and is concerned and is willing to do the things necessary when it sees threats to democracy. If you don't have that, an FBI is not going to save you. So far, our judicial system has helped, but there's no, as we've seen what's been happening over the last few months, that's not necessarily a guarantee. It's really about whether there's an informed population, sort of going back to what the founders envisioned,
right?
An informed population that is consulted regularly and is concerned with protecting its democracy. And that's really, at the end of the day, that's the only guarantee.
Concerned for protecting its democracy versus being concerned that its particular party wins against the other party at no matter the cost.
And that's kind of in a sense, it's sort of become, again, it's almost like if you hear what's going on social media, talk shows and all that, it's almost like sports radio in the sense of, you're supporting your team, hell or high water. Who cares if what the quarterback did last night? I don't care. So I do think that that's what I've sort of seen evolve in at least the two countries that I study. And but I think you're exactly right. Those are that's the sort of sentiment. That's the only thing that really will guarantee whether or not democracy continues in the direction that we want, or if it starts continually degrading over time.
Yeah, I've seen some conservatives say the worst possible things about the Democratic Party. I won't even repeat them. But I've also seen some Democrats, and I would go, well, what about this person was corrupt and they did this and they did that, or they hit someone? And the response was always, okay, but they're not Trump. And that was it. That was good enough. I don't care. The guy ran over somebody, embezzled $1 billion. He's not Trump. And they would say it like they're proud of it. Like, yeah, but he's not Trump. Like they're, I'm on the right side of history and they're proud. And then people in the room would be like, that's right. That's right. And I'm like, okay, well then, and I would try to explain to them that attitude, while I don't like Trump too, is not a friend of democracy.
Right. No, I think you're exactly right. Regardless of party, both parties play. And so it's trying to get past that is, I think, what's extremely important. There are people that are, but unfortunately, I think what social media does is it rewards those who are not like that.
Right.
And it sort of mutes the voices of people who share that kind of outlook.
I've heard that social media. So if you do extreme things or say extreme things, people want to watch the video. Social media is a company. They're there to make money. The more eyeballs on a video, the more advertising money they can sell. And so I've seen a lot of people bring up social media, and I go, great. How are we going to tell these companies whose number one goal is to make profit to stop doing the thing that brought them record profits? I wait for a good answer. Nobody's coming up.
Well, there's again, it relies on. Well, there's two ways. One is to stop using it. The second way is to hold our representatives accountable for enacting some sense of common sense regulation that might make a difference. And so, but we're sort of in the early stages of it. I think it's only been just in the last few years, sort of like, it took a while for people to understand how hazardous cigarettes were. I think it's going to be just as it's going to be a process in, okay, what are the effects of these things and how can we mitigate them? And it can be through, some of it can just be through legislation. Others, it'll just be people saying, you know what, I'm not going to get involved with that. And then that's going to be something where, if it's not profitable, they'll stop pretty quickly.
That's the one good answer I've heard is that you can't force them, but if you can change the consumer base to say, I'm not watching that, I'm not going to recommend that, I won't use that, I'm looking for someone who's a little more balanced, then you could do that. And we've certainly, like you said, seen that with cigarettes. It was controversial. People eventually got the idea cigarettes cause cancer, cut down on smoking. The other one is violence in movies. Movies were very violent in the 1980s. Somewhere around the early 90s, they had we need less violent movies. And they actually got customers to just say, I don't want to go see super violent movies. I want explosions and effects, but can you make it more of an adventure, Indiana Jones versus Schwarzenegger Commando? I'm a big Schwarzenegger fan, but it worked. It worked. We can do this, but it took time.
Yeah.
Right. It took time. It was like slow and educating and the public, and it wasn't looking at the legislators to come up with something or the corporations. It was changing the consumer base. I could see that, but that's not something that changes in a year, right? We're looking at a generational change, maybe.
I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but people's opinions towards things can change, with an important event. I think you're right. I think in general, one can say, this is going to be a long process, but it could also be that either a series of events can cause people to change their behavior pretty darn quickly. I think the pandemic showed us that is possible. And so, again, I'm always looking for silver linings here.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think there are some examples there where it's like, no, if people understand the risks, then they'll act accordingly. But we're just trying to find out we're only just now learning what those risks are.
I recall, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe just 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook went to the Senate, and he had to explain to them how a Facebook page works on national TV. And I remember the senator going, what if I don't want chocolate? Why is there chocolate advertising? And he's like, that it doesn't matter what you want. It's what the algorithm is. This. And he had to explain the whole thing. And you could tell most of them weren't getting it. Yeah. And I'm like, oh my God. And we're expecting these people to regulate this industry. And he's explaining what most of the public already knows to them. I'm like, it's going to be some time before we get some quality regulation at this pace. Or we start getting a lot younger senators. I don't know, one of the two. Okay, we'll leave it there. Last two questions for you. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this video. They said, wow, I learned a lot. I didn't know that about corruption. That's interesting. New take on polarization. There's a lot of material here. I'm struggling to get it and remember it. But there was this one thing that the professor, Dean, said in that presentation. It's 5 days after I finished watching the video. And while I struggle to remember everything, I can't get that one thought he said out of my head. What is that one thought you want a random person you'll never meet to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after they watch the video?
I think that Polarization. So I would say that the implication that there can be some good aspects, sort of like you mentioned with your bacteria, there can be some good aspects to polarization. And so just to completely define it as one thing, one dimensional, and say that it's bad, I think if we unpack it a little bit, there might be some things about polarization, like watching government like a hawk, holding each other accountable. Those are things that they're in there and we shouldn't lose them. Let me put it that way.
That was good. Last question. You don't have to answer, but we always ask, is there anybody you could recommend to be part of an honest conversation? We always try to keep the conversation going. You don't have to answer, but we always ask, is there anybody you could recommend? They could be an academic, they could be an activist, or you could know them, you could not know them. Somebody you think might be interesting to interview.
I would certainly, I would point to, if you want other perspectives on this particular work, my co-authors certainly.
Okay.
But I'd be happy. Let me think about that, and I'd be happy to suggest any names.
I'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody you have? I hope you found this was a fair interview. We don't do gotcha journalism. It's just straightforward.
No, not at all.
Anybody who's an academic, they could be an activist, they could be a reporter. Really, we're just looking for people who can think intelligently. They could be on the left, they could be on the right, but we're looking for, I can explain my position in a holistic manner, and it's juicy for the public to understand or to get their teeth into. I'll leave it there. Thank you for coming out, Dean.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. I'll leave it there. I will email you in a couple hours a copy of the video, and I want to say thank you for your time. I know your time is very precious and you're a very busy man. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out today, sir.
Thank you, Marcus. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
I'll email you shortly.